so far they do a lot of talking and no action.
When are those talks, Mr. President?
They've already started.
Do you want regime change in Iran?
Well, it seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In the meantime, we've lost a lot of lives while they talk, and legs blown off, arms blown off, faces blown off. It's been going on for a long time. So let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens. That's the famous statement of President Trump. He says very often that was yesterday, where he's basically saying, regime change with Iran would be great. To try to figure out, are we on the cusp of war? Is there still a chance for diplomacy? There is diplomacy going on, but does it actually have a chance, or is it window dressing? We have Trita Parsi back with us, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, somebody who just got back from the Munich Security Conference where he talked about this issue with a lot of different people. We're going to be interested to hear that. Trita, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Danny.
Well, listen, let's just start off with Trump's comment there, because one of the reasons why we chose that particular one to highlight is because he's using some of the language there that Jack Keane has been using this past week in actually the last 2 weeks, where he's been almost on public television begging President Trump to attack Iran, not to use negotiations. He keeps mentioning, they've been doing this for 47 years. And you heard Trump say, all these Americans are getting their legs blown off and stuff. We've been killing forever, and, they can't be talked to. So a regime change would be great. Are you concerned that he seems to be adopting some of the language of those who were advocating for war with Iran?
Oh, absolutely. And we've seen that already from December 29th, in which once Netanyahu came to the White House and had a meeting with him, he started talking about missiles, which was something that he had done before. And then when he wants to go in the direction of diplomacy, then he just zeroes in on just talking about the nuclear program and making sure that there's no nuclear weapons, which is one red line that could work. But if you throw in missiles and everything else that he doesn't, if he now then throws in regime change and starts to talk about accusations that the Iranians killed Americans in Iraq, etc., then that certainly does lend itself for building a case for a war. But I think we have to be frank also of recognizing that what Trump wants to do more than anything else is to confuse people and be unpredictable. And I think he's quite successful at it, because you have plenty of data points that point to the direction of confrontation, and there's also a lot of data points that point to the direction of a potential de-escalation, and we just don't know exactly where he will go.
Well, I certainly know where I hope he goes, but let's look at some of those data points for escalation, which you talked about a second ago, and that is in the amount of combat power that is in the region and still streaming there, heading in that direction right now. This is a current update here. This is in the CENTCOM, EUCOM, and INDOPACOM air and naval assets, especially. Many of these are in the area where they can focus on a potential war with Iran. You see there's 2 aircraft carriers, 15 destroyers, a number of other command ships, and then specifically looking at the 2 aircraft carrier strike groups that are there or on the way. And you see you have, I think, somewhere around 600 Tomahawk cruise missiles potential between all of those ships, a lot of air defense capabilities as well, a lot of things on the ground. But, I mean, you're talking about a profound amount of combat power there. Really, we haven't seen that much. Maybe we saw that, something close to that in 2024 and again in 2025 when we 2024 when we helped Israel attack or defend against an attack from Iran, and then also in 2025 when we joined in that 12-day war for 1 day, or actually a couple of hours or so. But then a lot of that went away. The fact that much power is there, and with Trump just making that comment about regime change, I mean, that seems to be some of the data points that tend towards he may use it.
Absolutely. And the fact that he's put out all of these different red lines, which he so far haven't enforced, but doesn't mean that he won't choose to enforce it at a later point. You have the adoption of Israeli red lines, which are designed to cause diplomacy to collapse and push the U.S. towards war. You have, plenty of these different things happening. And of course, as you said, once you have this type of mobilization, it may actually create a momentum of its own that even Trump may not be able to withstand. And at a minimum, he feels the urge of doing something militarily. But the problem he has, if that is his calculation, is that the message from the Iranian side is that anything militarily, anything will lead to a full-scale war. And I don't think that is just a bluff. I know that the administration doesn't think that that is just a bluff, because the Trump administration in early January, around 10th or so, had sent a message to the Iranians saying, let us just do a quick attack on a couple of bases. You can evacuate them, and then you can do a symbolic retaliation, and then we'll call it a day. And the Iranians said no. They told them, no, if you attack, even if it's just on a limited scale, it will be full-scale war. The Israelis sent a message saying, we're going to stay out of this war as long as you don't attack us. And the Iranians told them, if the U.S. attacks us, we will attack you, because we know that you are behind the U.S. attacking us. So I think even if he's just looking for something small, something face-saving militarily, so that he can say, I did all of this build-up and I did something with it, it does not appear as it will lead to just a small exchange. It will.
And, you know, and I'm sorry, I just got to say this. It's kind of as an aside. It's really rich that the Israelis, if that report is true, are saying, listen, I want the United States military, all that combat power, all those people to take the risk of a war, to do it all. And I'm just going to sit on the side here and watch, and I'll stay out of it as long as you don't attack me. I mean, that is the height of impudence.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that this is not addressed and shone a light on in mainstream media is just shocking, because here you have the Israelis very explicitly saying, we wanted this war, we're pushing for this war, but we're going to stay out of this war. So you just fight with the U.S., as if the U.S.'s military is a mercenary army that the Israelis can use at will, even without paying for it, of course.
What the, yeah, and so they don't want any of those missiles coming toward their area, but they apparently are fine with them coming towards American troops in the base in the region, and killing maybe our ships being blown up and our airplanes being knocked out of the sky. They seem to be okay with that.
Totally fine.
That by itself is pretty disgusting.
But if we throw out a couple of the data points that point in the other direction, there's a few there as well. And one thing I think we should say that also includes the Israelis is that if you take a look at what happened after December 29th, it seems like Netanyahu was quite successful, perhaps beyond anything many people had expected. I certainly had not expected it. My prediction was that the Israelis would attack Iran before end of the year. Instead, it appears that he went there and he managed to convince Trump to take the lead on this. Instead of the Israelis leading the attack and the U.S. supporting it, the U.S. itself would lead us, because we saw how Trump really took ownership of the coming war. And we saw how Netanyahu took a very, very silent position. For several weeks, he didn't say anything publicly about this. That, to me, was the worst sign, because it essentially meant that he was confident that he had put things in the right trajectory for him and that there would be a war, and he was being silent in order to reduce the criticism against Trump from his own base that he was doing this for Israel. Trump himself took the lead, took ownership of this, and allowed the Israelis to essentially get away. Then something happens in the talks that apparently changes the equation, and Netanyahu comes back to the United States. And by all accounts, that meeting did not appear to be particularly successful. Now, is it deception? Could be deception. But it's interesting that now suddenly Netanyahu is actually going out there, putting red lines for the talks, putting criteria for what the talks need to achieve in order to be successful. Again, back to that type of a public posture of pressuring Trump from the outside, something he hadn't done for about 5 weeks, because things were going his way. It appears things are not going his way right now. And as a result, he's back trying to influence and sabotage the talks from the outside rather than from the inside. The same game plan he's had for more than 20 years. Already back in 2009, we saw that when Obama was first starting to have negotiations with the Iranians, Netanyahu's game plan was to just go out there and constantly put out public criteria of what it needed to achieve in order for it to be acceptable to him, as if he is the most important party to these negotiations.
And I didn't work very well back at that point, but that we lost that opportunity in 2018. But I don't want to rehash that. But you talked about some positive data points. One of the other ones is the fact that tomorrow in Switzerland there's going to be a meeting between the United States and Iran. So at least that there's going to be the possibility of nuclear talks. Now, you just got back from Munich. I wonder if you can give us a little insight into, especially among Europeans or any other of the parties that have to do with negotiations here. Is there any hope that these are going to work?
So I got to tell you, in Munich, the conversation really was not about diplomacy. In general, it's not about diplomacy. Munich has just turned into every year more and more of a neoconservative flavor to the conversations. If we could just take one tangent and talk about Marco Rubio's speech that got a standing ovation from the Europeans over there. If you listen carefully to that speech, this is Marco Rubio essentially saying that there can be a new partnership with Europe, but it's going to have to be based on an embrace of empire, an embrace of recolonization, an embrace of, instead of just having an American empire, he was talking about a Western civilization. All of these different things that Europeans by and large have left for quite some time, ideas that they don't longer hold, was the basis for this new type of a partnership. And the Europeans gave him a standing ovation. It's as if it doesn't matter what the basis of the partnership is, as long as the Europeans are allowed to live in the illusion that they have American protection. For that, they gave him a standing ovation. But that really, I think in many ways, encapsulated what the flavor of Munich was, which is the Europeans still struggling to be able to get under an American security umbrella and are willing to adopt any neoconservative, any type of ideas, all the way into explicit empire in order to be able to have that. So Iran in that context was not talked about, at least any of the conversations I saw, in terms of diplomacy, but it was all about regime change. They had the son of the former Shah there giving speeches, etc. So I think Europe has just gone in a direction that it's increasingly difficult to see how that is not a conference that I understand why Lindsey Graham felt so home and so comfortable in Munich. It really was his intellectual home.
That's by itself a condemnation on us that was the case on Lindsey Graham. Why do you suppose it is that Europe is in that condition right now? You can make the argument, many do, that the United States, especially Donald Trump, but all the political elite from both parties in the United States are heavily funded by AIPAC and other, and heavily influenced by Israeli things. The religious component of the United States, especially the evangelicals, are really big supporters of it. So you can kind of see how that's going to work. I disagree with it, but I can understand it. I can see it. But Europe is less so. Why is Europe so deferential to not even going down the path of diplomacy, not even wanting to explore that with Iran, and seem to be embracing the Lindsey Graham version?
So I think there's a couple of factors. Overall in Europe, we have seen that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the shock state that they're in which they are tripling down on any form of a partnership alliance with the United States, terrified of the US abandoning them. And as a result, giving up values, interests, left and right, whatever they need to give up just to be able to get back to it. I was in the audience last year when JD gave his speech and really shocked the Europeans. And I thought that finally they may have woken up and recognized that they need to stand on their own legs, and they actually need to have a recalibrated relationship with the US, one that I think actually would be better for the US. I think the US needs a European partner that can think for itself, that can actually be a conduit for diplomacy. The Europe that stood up against the Iraq invasion in 2003, and every once in a while can tell us that this idea of yours is a little bit nutty, you might want to rethink it. That's the type of Europe that ultimately I think is better for the US to have than one that is actually trying to out-hawk the United States by proving that it could be a good vassal by just out-vassaling itself. And that's the Europe that we're seeing right now. This just absolute terrification that they will be faced with a hostile United States. And I thought after Greenland, at a minimum, they would have realized that they need to start putting their eggs in several different baskets. But Rubio gave them a speech that they all called reassuring. And reassuring is perhaps the wrong message at this point. I don't believe that there should be a hostile approach in any way, shape, or form. And I think the JD speech was too much in that direction. But taking away the realization that they need to reach, that they need to stand on their own legs, and they need to be a partner for the United States, one that is a thinking partner, not just one that is a vassal, I think is the wrong approach to push them back in that direction. Now, when it comes to Iran, it is really sad to see what Europe has turned into. Europe, again, in 2003, stepped up and created the E3 to help negotiate a nuclear deal. And
right, yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. The key objective was to make sure that the United States did not double down on the huge mistake of Iraq, first having invaded Iraq and next invading Iran. It would be a disaster, they predicted. They would have been correct. And they stepped in diplomatically to prevent it. And to a certain extent, even though they didn't get a long-standing nuclear deal, they were successful in making sure that at least one added obstacle towards a rush towards war with Iran had been added. But Europe today, the E3 today, is not that E3. Now the diplomacy, the effort to create peace is coming from the Gulf Arab states. It's coming from Turkey. It's coming from regional partners of the United States that recognize how disastrous this would be for the region as a whole. They're the ones who are conducting the diplomacy. They're the ones who are also frustrated that Europe at times even comes across as sabotaging that diplomacy. And of course, the Europeans are very upset at Iran for the support that Iran has given Russia in Ukraine, including the drones that the Russians are using. But there's nevertheless an emotional component to the manner in which the Europeans are approaching Iran today that again lends itself much more towards this type of a moralistic neoconservative approach rather than the much more calculated geostrategic approach that the Europeans used to have in a previous war, but now seem to have no shed of it left.
Yeah, that's a really well put there, and I think it's important to bring up that connection with the Russia-Ukraine issue there, and why Europeans may not like maybe antagonistic to Iran for that reason. That's certainly not a good reason to want to use military force, and something could grossly backfire. More on that in a minute. But I want to circle back around to Rubio, because he made and I think that this particular soundbite here is separate from that speech, but also in context of the Munich Security Conference, where he's talking specifically about the Iran issue. And he's talking at the first like it's a diplomatic issue, but then when you get into what he's characterizing the Iranians as nearly being incapable of having diplomacy. Watch this.
Look, doing a deal with Iran is not easy. I said it yesterday, I'll repeat it again today. I mean, we have to understand that Iran ultimately is governed, and its decisions are governed by Shia clerics, radical Shia clerics, okay? These people make policy decisions on the basis of pure theology. That's how they make their decisions. So it's hard to do a deal with Iran. We've always said it's hard, but we're going to try. And I think there's an opportunity here to diplomatically reach an agreement that addresses the things we're concerned about. We would be very open and welcoming to that. But I don't want to overstate it either. It's going to be hard.
Yeah, it's going to be hard, but it's going to be harder if you're ascribing to the other side something that's different. Now, I have viewed, and that's why I really want your expertise view on here. I have viewed Iran as very pragmatic and somebody who's very rational in their calculations. I don't agree with a lot of the things they do, and a lot of it's bad, but it's I've seen grounded in geopolitical realities, military balance of power understandings, and it's practical and it's logical. But he's saying, no, it's grounded in this radical religious fervor that's based their policies on religious things. How do you see that?
Well, what we see here is the neoconservative character of Rubio coming forward, because this is a neoconservative argument that was being used in the early 2000s in order to justify not only why there was a need for a war with Iran, but also why there could not be any diplomacy and what there needed to be a preemptive war. Look at what the construct of this argument is. Essentially saying the Iranians are irrational, ideological, and also, although he didn't say it in this speech, what usually comes is that they are suicidal. Well, if a side is irrational and suicidal and ideological, what it means is that you cannot have deterrence, because deterrence requires rationality on the other side. You can also not wait for the war because the other side is suicidal. So they're going to attack first. So you have to then take a preemptive attack. And you cannot have diplomacy because with a suicidal, irrational entity, there's no way that you can have any diplomacy. So essentially, it's an accusation, a core fact seeking to be established that will force the debate in one direction only. And that is in the direction of a preventive or preemptive war. Because neither deterrence, diplomacy, nothing else will work. Reality is, of course, they're not. They have an ideology. I would say that in many ways right now, they're paralyzed. They're making terrible decisions. But the idea that they're irrational, that they're ideological, that they're making decisions on Shia ideology, I don't think Rubio knows a thing about Shia ideology. It's just completely false. false, but he knows it's false. Is an argument designed to push the United States in the direction of conflict, and it always was. Now, what's fascinating is that if you read or you listen to Rubio's speech, that was a highly ideological speech. A speech in which he says, militaries don't go to war over abstractions. And instead, he starts talking about Western civilization and uses that term apparently 14 times in the speech, as if that is not an abstraction. And from a standpoint of restraint, I have to say, part of the reason I think a lot of restrainers, at the core of what restraint has been about is to make sure that we have a much more narrow definition of U.S. interest, so that we don't get unnecessarily entangled in all of these conflicts far away from the United States that actually do not matter to the U.S. It is the expansion of the definition of U.S. interest that has led the U.S. into all of these different wars. We say that we're out there to defend the free world. We're out there to defend our alliance structures that are just ever expanding. Restraint has been about going back to a much more narrow focus so that we actually can be more of a normal country. Not to say that we shouldn't have allies, not to say that there's certain ideas that are not important, but not things that we constantly go to war over. But we went now in Rubio's speech from a talk about the US needs to defend its allies to now we have to defend Western civilization. What is that? What is the definition of that? I mean, this is a massive expansion of what US interest is that would get the United States into far more wars than we even have been in the last 34 years.
That's quite a statement because the amount we've been there has been pretty ugly on top of that. But let's take a look now and see, is diplomacy even possible with that characterization by the United States side? Then let's look over at what's going to be opposite us in Switzerland here in a day or so. And that is on the Iranian side. So Foreign Minister Arakchi this past weekend was interviewed by Rick Sanchez. And in that conversation, he said, listen, we want to have a negotiation. We want to have something that's better than the Obama deal. So we're willing to talk about things that have to do with the enrichment percentages. We'll go down. We'll have some constraints there, et cetera. But then in a conversation yesterday, Foreign Minister Arakchi said this.
I must say this very clearly and precisely. Iran's missiles and defense system will never be subject to any negotiations.
So that's pretty categorical. Do you think that he's just saying that in advance of negotiations, or do you think he really means that?
I do think that they mean that. And it's not because of an Shiite ideology or anything of that kind. It's the fact that the missiles are the only deterrence Iran has left against Israel, against other states, but particularly against Israel. Iran no longer can rely on a latent nuclear program as a deterrence. It no longer can rely on these different groups that it has been supporting, from Hezbollah to Iraqi militias, or the Houthis or Hamas, although Hamas never was particularly supported by Iran. But obviously the loss of Assad is very huge for the Iranians. So they're totally exposed. They don't have much of an air force. They clearly don't have strong air defense systems. The only thing they have is the missiles. If you take the missiles away, Iran is completely defenseless against Israel. And we've seen what Israel has done to countries that are defenseless. It bombs the heck out of them. We saw on Israeli TV how the Israeli officials were talking about how 20 minutes after Assad boarded the plane to Russia, the Israelis went in and bombed everything. The term that they used, it said, we turned all of Syria into a shooting range. Because once it no longer had the ability to defend itself, the Israelis went in, took out whatever capability existed in order to ensure that whatever regime would follow would not be able to in any way, shape, or form challenge Israeli domination. Now, I can see that the Iranians wouldn't, for instance, would be able to agree to not proliferating the missile or the missile technology, certain limitations on the length of the missiles that would not reach the US, for instance. But if the US is pushing for the Iranians to not have missiles that can reach Israel, not the US, not reach Israel, I cannot see how the Iranians would agree to that, because that would mean that they would be completely defenseless against Israel.
Yeah, and then we have the other elephant in the room, which is the Israeli side. And you mentioned this at the top of the show. Now, I want to show our listeners who might have seen it this past weekend. Benjamin Netanyahu threw in his 2 cents, or maybe it was $2 worth of a message, I think was primarily directed at the White House, of saying, hey, here's what we need these negotiations to result in.
Several components that we believe are important not only for the security of Israel, but for the security of the world, the United States, the region, the world. The first is that all enriched material has to leave Iran. The second is that there shall be no enrichment capability, not stopping the enrichment process, but dismantle the equipment and the infrastructure that allows you to enrich in the first place. And the third is to deal also with the questions of ballistic missiles. There's an MTCR limitation of 300 kilometers, and Iran is supposed to adhere to it. Of course it doesn't, as the Rising Lion operation by itself manifested. Everybody knows that. And the fourth is dismantle the axis of terror that Iran has built. It's been smashed, but it's still there. It's trying to recover, as Iran itself is trying to do.
So he's basically saying that nothing that Iran wants can be acceptable, especially the one that Foreign Minister Araghchi mentioned, which is the missile issue. So you have two very competing issues, and then you have the United States in the middle. Is that a thread that can be needled, a needle that can be threaded?
I mean, all depends on whether the United States pursues its own interest or whether it follows diktats by the Israeli prime minister. If it follows the diktats of the Israeli prime minister that are designed to make sure that diplomacy doesn't work, then yeah, for certain, diplomacy will not work, and we will end up in the war that the Israelis are hoping that we end up in. If Trump, however, pursues U.S. interests and asks what is actually really crucial to the U.S., goes back to his original red line, which was no nuclear weapon, there's absolutely a deal that can be found on those terms, as there was before. That's the same term that was for the JCPOA to ensure that there would be no nuclear weapon. Now, Trump can get a better deal, a stricter deal than the JCPOA. The Iranians are trying to entice him by also then offering business opportunities, which in many ways would actually be huge for the United States. But I personally don't think that that is enough. I think Trump needs something more symbolic. He needs to be able to say that I ended 47 years of enmity between the United States and Iran, which means that the Iranians would have to do something that they have not been willing to do so far. So far, what they've been trying to do is to reduce tensions with the United States without having a reconciliation with the United States. I think the era of that is over. I think for Trump, ultimately, for something to be successful, he wants to be able to say that he made peace, that he had reconciliation. What that actually manifests in, whether it's normalization of relations, which would be going very far, or something less than that, is perhaps details. But something like that, I think, is actually what Trump would be looking for, rather than just being able to have business opportunities, even though that is not in and of itself a small thing at all. I mean, this is a massive market, the largest market that would open up since the fall of the Soviet Union. But again, I think Trump is looking for something that is beyond just business.
Now, I want to look here just a second at the maybe if you call it the fifth column that's working against this, and that is primarily people that support President Trump and are in his inner circle are almost more rabid even than Rubio or Benjamin Netanyahu, depending on some of the sound bites we've shown here in the last week or so. I've got a separate one here in a minute I'm going to show you. But let me ask you, one of the claims that's made by all of these advocates is that Iran is this destabilizing factor, and they, for 47 years, have been killing everybody and attacking Americans and exporting terror, etc. But when I did some research this past week for a separate show that we did, we looked at how many times since 2010 has Israel attacked Iran, whether that's through cyber or something else, but inside of Iran. And there was a number of times going back to 2010 with Stuxnet and a bunch of other stuff, assassinations of scientific leaders, military leaders, all kinds of things, when it culminated in the 12-day war last year. But then when you look at the Iranian side, it said that Iran had never attacked directly into Israel until I think it was 2024 when they retaliated after their embassy had been attacked in Syria. So that says that from 1949 to 2024, Iran had never attacked Israel. So the question is Iran really that destabilizing factor in the Middle East?
So one thing to clarify, though, from the Israeli perspective, they view attacks by Hezbollah or attacks by Hamas as being driven by Iran because Iran has been supporting them. If we were to count it that way, the attacks by Israel would increase even further because of support that the Israelis have given to Kurdish groups, to Baluchi groups that have conducted a very large number of attacks on Iranian territory. But going to the core of your question, I think it's absolutely critical to reassess some of these things. In 2021, we did a report and we looked at interventions by regional states in the region between 2010 and 2020. We were going to test this accusation that Iran is the source of instability in the region. Turn out that Iran actually is a very interventionist country. It has intervened in many, many different conflicts in its neighborhood, not necessarily as much against Israel, but in Iraq and other places. However, by 2015, it was overtaken by both Turkey and the UAE, who are actually intervening throughout the region on a far larger scale, or on a larger scale, not far, but on a larger scale than the Iranians were. What was also interesting is that 5 out of the 6 states that were the most interventionist in the region next to Iran were all funded and armed and supported by the United States. Reality is that this is a region in which almost no one has any clean hands. The report is called No Clean Hands. There are a lot of interventionist states that all have contributed to the instability, and the instability contributes to them intervening because it creates vacuums that sucks them back in. It is not to say that Iran in any way, shape, or form is innocent, but it's to realize that if you think that the only problem is Iran, you're completely misdiagnosing the problem. There are too many interventionist states in the region, but also the instability in the region itself actually propels countries that otherwise did not want to be that interventionist to start intervening. And it becomes a very self-fulfilling prophecy, and it just fuels itself. The way out of this is to create a security architecture that is inclusive, that actually enables the region to escape this. And you cannot do that unless it is all-inclusive. And you cannot have an all-inclusive security architecture if you think that the security architecture is there to isolate just one country or one block of countries because you have misdiagnosed the problem as if they are the issue here. And that is part of the problem with this approach of just trying to pin all of the blame on Iran, or earlier on, it was pinning all of the blame on Iran and Iraq. That's a strategy used if you actually want to go to war with that country rather than actually resolving the problems.
So let me ask you a question, and I just play devil's advocate for a second. Lindsey Graham last week, in one of his many pleadings for war, said, listen, if you take out Iran, then you can create a whole new dynamic, maybe its own architecture, that you take that one destabilizing factor out of the way, and now then everybody else and many of these other ones, like you said, one of the common denominators is that the United States helps fund them. So would that not suggest that if you take Iran out, take them off the board, as Jack Keane put it, that you're going to have everybody relatively copacetic, or will these other ones cause disruption in other ways?
Completely false. And again, this is one of these fake arguments and assertions that have been floating around by the neoconservatives since the early 2000s in order to justify another war with Iran. If you diagnose the entire problem in the region being with one country, then the obvious solution is to take out that country. And that's what they're aiming for. But if you take a look at the conduct of regional states right now, they fundamentally disagree with this. Even though at one point they did agree with it because they wanted the US to take out Iran, that is not the case any longer. The efforts by the Saudis, the Pakistanis, the Turks, the Omanis, the Qataris, the Egyptians to prevent this war is precisely because they recognize that such a war would be disastrous to the region rather than ushering in some sort of a new era of peace and collaboration. And on top of that, they now see Israel as the most threatening and destabilizing actor in the region. They see Iran, who they have deep problems and disagreements with, as a final buffer between themselves and Israel at this point, because they no longer can count on the United States for support. They no longer can count on the United States to even restrain Israel not to attack them. The Turks don't believe that NATO will come to their defense if Israel attacks Turkey. The Qataris have already seen what happens when you just rely on American security. The Israelis attacked and the American air defense systems were not even activated. So now they're looking to each other to find some way of balancing against Israel. And even though Iran is not part of that new configuration, at least not formally, informally, it is a buffer between Israel and these countries. So the idea of taking Iran out would be a disaster for these countries. That's why they're working so hard to overcome the current problems and actually get to avoid a war and get to some sort of an agreement. Completely contradictory to what that senator from South Carolina, who appears to never spend any time in South Carolina, is saying about the region.
But let's look at that dynamic in a different light there. If Iran was taken off the board, as Jack Keane suggested, I mean, let's for the moment, let's just hypothetically say that there is a war and it's successful, and we'll define how that means later. But the net was that Iran is off the board. Would Israel be a threat, and would they just change their target from Iran and put it on somebody else, or would they finally say, okay, now we can live in peace?
That is the fear, because what these countries are seeing is that since the Biden administration lifted all constraints on Israel, Israel is seeking to establish its military hegemony in the region. And they say so explicitly, even though these were murmurs in the past. Now, explicitly, these countries, both the Qataris and the Turks, have said that they reject Israeli hegemony. If Iran is taken out, the next targets will be most likely Turkey or Saudi Arabia or both. We've already seen that Turkey's success in Syria caused major tensions between Israel and Turkey. And we are seeing exactly what we saw in 1991. In the entire 80s and 70s, the Israelis and the Iranians were actually on the same side geopolitically. In the 70s, formally as allies, even though it was denied, nevertheless, everyone knew that there was an alliance there. And in the 1980s, even during the time of the Shah, they still collaborated because they had the common geopolitical interests. Both of them were threatened by the Soviet Union, its Arab partners. And we saw that particularly once Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, the Israelis were the ones who were lobbying for Iran in the 1980s. They were the ones who were telling the Americans, don't pay attention to Iran's Shia ideology and their rhetoric. Talk to them and even sell arms to them. And we saw that in the Iran-Contra scandal. 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, Saddam Hussein is defeated, and the two factors that had driven Iran and Israel closer together, which was these two common threats, were gone. Suddenly, out of the blue, the Israelis started to talk about Iran as the next big threat. It was a huge shift. Within 5 years, they had gone from pushing Donald Reagan to make a deal with the Iranians to suddenly saying Iran is the biggest threat. And that's the same thing we suddenly saw after the Turks succeeded in Syria. Now suddenly the Israelis were talking about Erdogan being the most dangerous person in the Middle East, Turkey being the new threat. Look at what the pro-Israeli voices in Washington are saying. Their gaze is toward Turkey as the next target once the Iranians would be completely taken off the chessboard. So if you're sitting in Saudi Arabia, that means that you're next afterwards. So these countries are now really terrified of what it means to live under Israeli hegemony. And as a result, despite the fact that they themselves have no love for the Islamic Republic, look what they're trying to do to prevent the war. It's not just because of a fear of instability. It's not just because of a fear of refugee flows. It's because of the geopolitical scenario in which without Iran, they're the next target.
Wow, that's not something that gets much airtime here in the Western world. That's really important because those dynamics are at play, whether anybody talks about them or not. But I want to shift gears, the amount of time we have here, back to the potential military outcome. So whatever should be done, whatever the United States ought to do we're looking at our own national interest, it certainly seems like we're still pressuring back to those negative data points on the ones pushing towards war. You had this comment, I think it was from this morning on Fox News by a former Assistant Secretary of State who seems to be setting the stage. Seems like he's reading from the Benjamin Netanyahu talking points when he said this.
Two carrier battle groups can be highly convincing. That having been said, what Marco Rubio said a moment ago is exactly right. We're dealing with a radical theocracy, one that had no hesitation just weeks ago killing 7,000 to 10,000 of its own people to hold on to power. So on the one hand, what happens when between a rock and a hard place. I think something significant is going to happen. It may be kinetic. I think President Trump is not someone to be toyed with, and I think the Iranians know it. So the only thing that they really have to do is do some internal questioning about whether it's worth dying for the cause, because I honestly think if they do not give ground on the nuclear side, and if they do not give ground on the missile structure that they currently have, at the end of the day, this theocracy is in for some serious kinetic reaction.
And that's, that's two of the 4 points that Netanyahu said yesterday. That video was yesterday, not today. So you see that those were both said on the same day. And so the question is, now that second aircraft carrier strike group is nearing completion on there, I think it'll be in position within just a few days from now. I mean, it's looking like that we are setting up to where the diplomatic contradictions, I guess, from the Iranian side and what the U.S./Israeli side, they're just not compatible. I don't see a way that this gets solved diplomatically to where everybody can be happy. How do you see it?
So I think it's very important not to conclude that this is inevitable, because that's what the other side wants. Those who favor war, they want to make the claim that it is inevitable. Once you think it is inevitable, you're not going to resist it because it's inevitable. So I think they're trying to portray a scenario. And I have to say, this is Fox News. Fox has been doing this for more than 3 decades. They only let those voices on to say these kind of things. That just repeats what the Israeli prime minister is saying. And we saw that during the June war as well, that they were the ones that were really cheering Trump on, whereas much of his MAGA base were quite opposed, or at least hesitant about this whole thing. Is there a way? Yes, I can see Trump getting a deal in which he says, look, I got a much better deal. I got what I wanted on the nuclear issue. On the missile front, the Iranians have agreed to not proliferate it. They've agreed to never do a first strike. And this is an agreement I've done to protect Israel. Israel should be very happy what I've done to protect them. No president has been more pro-Israel than me. I've also opened up the Iranian market for businesses, etc., and this will be tremendously valuable for the American homeland, etc. I can see him having the flexibility of going in that direction. But if he does, he will be faced with a massive, massive onslaught of criticism from that Fox crowd, from that neoconservative crowd, from that pro-Israel crowd. And the question is he willing to make a deal that is good for the US and take that heat? Or is he going to try to do what he did last time, try to find a way to appease both sides, leave them not fully satisfied, but somewhat satisfied, which in last year meant that he did an attack on Iran, and he may think that that is still possible this time. But as I mentioned earlier on, I don't think it's possible this time, because the Iranians will respond fully this time around. And part of the problem is because the Iranians have the calculation that their negotiation position may be strengthened if there is a short but intense war. And the calculation behind their view is that they think that they can strike decisively against a lot of US assets in the region, 17 bases, plenty of ships now there, plenty of targets, and that once significant cost is inflicted on the United States, and Trump realizes that this is not going to be a glorious 24-hour operation a la Venezuela, this will drag on, and he does not know how it ends, that will cause him to withdraw, as he did with the Houthis. And then there will be renewed negotiations after some point, and then the Iranians believe they will be in a stronger position than they were before. I think it's an extremely dangerous calculation for many different reasons. But one of them is, if the Iranians were to do this, they might actually succeed in killing a relatively large number of Americans. I don't think we've ever been in a point in which 50, 100, 200 Americans have been killed under Donald Trump's watch. We do not know what his psychology is in that scenario. We do know what his psychology was when he was fighting the Houthis and gave up after 7 weeks, but not a single American had been killed.
Right.
We don't know. This would unlock a new level of Trump psychology. And you cannot just base that on what you've seen so far, because this would be new territory. So I think that's an extremely dangerous calculation, but it is one that the Iranians are making. And it's one that, again, if Trump thinks he can have a small war, the Iranians may also favor that, but they favor it because they believe that it will inflict so much cost on the United States that eventually there will be a better bargaining position for them.
And a couple of other things which I think are being signaled by the Iranian side to try and warned Trump against taking that cost, aside from the already claimed threat that they would attack American bases. But they also right now actually are in the Strait of Hormuz conducting a military operation where, yeah, you can throw that up there. It's intensive drills named Smart Control of the Hormuz Strait are being conducted by the IRGC naval forces under the supervision of the head of the IRGC. The drill aimed at testing the readiness of operational forces in the face of, quote, possible security and military threats, Tasnim news agency reported. To what extent do you say that it's legitimate that Iran may actually resort to closing the Strait of Hormuz in the event that we start attacking?
If there is an attack and we see that the attacks go after Iran's oil infrastructure, which is very likely, they wouldn't just go after missiles, would not just go after nuclear sites, but would go after Iran's economic interests, then I think it's almost guaranteed that the Iranians will respond by attacking oil infrastructure throughout the region and close down the Strait of Hormuz. This would shoot up oil prices dramatically. It would fuel inflation in the United States, and it would be a disaster for Trump's midterm elections. I think it's important to understand, I don't think the Iranians think they can win the war militarily, but victory from their end probably looks more like surviving the war long enough so that they have destroyed Trump's presidency. That's a very, very different proposition for victory from that which Trump will have to follow. So I think what is victory for them is not at all this type of a massive military victory. They just have to stay in the game long enough to destroy Trump's presidency. And a reminder, 20 years ago, and you would know much more about this than me, Danny, since you're a military expert, when we were talking about the Iranians closing down the Strait of Hormuz, there was talk about, putting in mines there and perhaps even sinking one ship in the middle of it that would cause a lot of mayhem. That's not what it means today. Today, it means the same thing that the Houthis did. They would just shoot at ships with missiles. Whether those missiles hit or not didn't matter. Traffic stopped because insurance costs for going through the Strait of Hormuz would shoot up so badly so that in effect, it would be closed off. Not because they actually succeeded, but simply for having tried.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that, once you start, I mean, that just would be catastrophic because once you close off the Strait of Hormuz and once you start blowing up any number of Americans, the President Trump's freedom of maneuver just shrinks almost to nothing. Then now he's almost got to go forward. I mean, I can't even imagine him backing down under pressure, which could make it much, much worse. Now, there's one other thing that's involved here, and I can't confirm this, but I can show it's being reported anyway, and that is that China has apparently been helping Iran in some indirect ways. We actually had this, I think it was last Friday, we had Alistair Crook who claimed that he has some sources that said that China had given some air defense radars that are very sophisticated, which could help Iran shoot down American planes if they get within range. And now here we have this claim here that Iran has received a number of Dongfeng 17 DF-17 missiles from China, which are very, very capable hypersonic glide vehicles. And here was Josh Rogan from Washington Post recently talking about what that can do to an aircraft carrier.
China has tested a new hypersonic missile that can defeat our aircraft carriers and our missile defense. In other words, we spent 30 years building aircraft carriers and missile defense, and the Chinese built a missile for 100,000th of the price that makes those things obsolete. That seems kind of important for people to know.
So we don't know for sure if the DF-17 can take down an American carrier. That's apparently what it was designed for. We don't know for sure that it's been given to Iran, but can we take that chance?
Again, I agree with you fully, because when it comes to taking that chance, it means that you have a cost-benefit analysis, right? And here we see the risks and the cost. The question is, what is the benefit to U.S. national interest? Trump said that he was not going to get into more wars, and now we have 1/3 of the U.S. Navy in the Middle East, taking on a much larger enemy or competitor than Iraq or the Houthis or anyone else was. For what interest? What is it that is so threatening to the U.S.'s core national interest that necessitates not an engagement, not addressing it, but necessitates military action? There is no such thing. This is all about the interest of the Israelis and the manner in which they're pushing for this. And the question is, wasn't this supposed to be America first? And wasn't America first supposed to be based on US national interests rather than the national interests of other countries? So when we look at these different things, I have no idea if the Chinese have provided that. I do believe that the Chinese are going to walk a very fine line. They're going to be very careful not to be overtly supportive of the Iranians in the war itself. But when it comes to sharing missile defense or other things, I don't see that being a problem for them at all. At the end of the day, we should remember that much of China's relative strength today is because of the manner in which the United States has relatively weakened itself over 2 decades of unnecessary wars in the Middle East. So if the United States continues to do that, that is not something that the Chinese are going to be very unhappy about. I remember, I think it was in 2006, if I remember correctly, a Chinese diplomat I was talking to, and I kind of challenged him a little bit. I said, look, come on, at the end of the day, you complain about the Iraq war, but you're very happy about how the US is undermining itself with this war. And he looked at me and he said, you know, our problem is that America is declining faster than China can rise. I thought that was a very painful comment to hear. But nevertheless, it is an acknowledgement of the fact that much of their relative rise is as a result of the US committing so many different mistakes in the Middle East. And this one would likely be the biggest of them all.
And final question here before we let you go. Let's look at both the Russia and the China issue involved with this, because Iran is a member of BRICS. Russia has a significant interest in Iran from the fact that they produce all these Shahed drones and other kinds of technology. China is definitely interested in Iran because they get a lot of oil from them. And so neither one of them really wants to see it go, see them lose that. But to what extent would they be willing to do anything that could potentially put them in the target list of the United States? Would they list that? But then the alternative is, if they literally do nothing, then they both lose geopolitically. How do you see that playing out?
I think the calculation has changed since Venezuela. They didn't do anything in Venezuela. They also were taken completely by surprise and did not expect that Trump would pursue military action in the manner that he did, and that he would keep much of the Maduro regime in place, but without Maduro, but then enforcing on them all kinds of different decisions that would go against Russian and Chinese interests. That does not mean, in my estimation, that they will do anything particularly overt in order to support Iran against the US. And they certainly are not going to do anything that will get themselves in a direct confrontation with the US. But will they do things to make it as difficult as possible for the US? Yes, because they can get away with that. And particularly mindful of the fact that, you know, Venezuelan oil is not that important to China. Iranian oil actually is very important to China. It will be costly for them. That doesn't mean they can't live without it. At the end of the day, they could try to switch over to Russian oil, etc. But ultimately, it means that the suppliers to China become fewer and fewer, and it becomes easier and easier for the United States to target those suppliers. And that's a dangerous situation for the Chinese to be in. So I think after Venezuela, they're going to be more inclined towards doing something, but it's not going to be something that will be calculated to allow them to get into confrontation with the US, but rather do exactly the opposite. Make it as tough as possible for the US to do this without getting directly entangled in a confrontation with the US.
And about Russia?
Well, in the Russian case, I think they are in a more dire situation. They're not going to do anything that risks what is most important for them right now, which is to get out of this war with Ukraine. And they want to make a deal, and they know that they can get a deal with Trump in a manner they likely cannot get with any other president. So they want to, you know, they're not going to risk anything outside of that core interest of theirs. And certainly not for Iran. And they don't have any obligation to Iran. They have their own agreements with Iran, but none of them have an Article 5 type of a component to it that actually is an absolute defense pact. And the Iranians don't have that expectation either. I mean, they may want to see more from the Russians and from the Chinese, but not in the sense that they actually, in their own minds, live in a world in which they have that type of a defense backup from the Russians or the Chinese.
Yeah, and you can certainly see an argument that both China and Russia would not like to lose the Iranian stuff, but to see the United States impale ourselves militarily on some of these things, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's anti-ship missiles. I mean, they've got their own. Even if they don't have the DF-17, Iran has plenty of anti-ship cruise missiles and other kinds of weapons that can cause lots of harm. And I can see both Russia and China saying, yeah, go after it.
And you saw the Israeli Prime Minister admit that in the clip that you mentioned, because he said that it was manifested in the Rising Lion operation. Yeah, because Israel got hit really, really hard by the Iranian missiles.
Yeah, and I sincerely hope and pray that your comment at the beginning of the show turns out to be the right one, that there are still some data points, maybe some of these, that can augur towards a diplomatic solution, and maybe Trump will recognize that the cost is just too high to even take a risk. So even with all this combat power in the region, I don't know that it's completely like that Robert Charles there was saying a second ago, like basically, oh yeah, we're heading in this direction. But it's going to be hard to keep him out, but I hope he does.
Thanks so much, Danny.
And yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Always appreciate it. We're going to keep a close eye on this as well. We have a couple of other shows today. We actually have that Rick Sanchez that was up earlier today. You can go on our channel and watch that this morning. He had some very interesting things to say about both Iran and the Russia-Ukraine war, etc. This afternoon, we're going to have kind of a special show that we haven't had a lot today, and that is with Robert Barnes, and that is at 2 o'clock, who's going to talk to us about what's going on with some of the issue in America with the Epstein files, with Attorney General Pam Bondi. Lots of fireworks have been happening in the United States over the last 4 or 5 days. We're going to have Robert Barnes on talking about some of that and some of the legality issues with this petition war in Iran, and how does that square with the U.S. Constitution and international and American law. Don't fail to turn in today. You're going to want to see that. Thanks very much, folks, and we'll see you at 2 o'clock on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.